I am not an economist. I know a little bit about geopolitics and a little bit about environmental sustainability and not too much about the global economy, but that's okay because these gentlemen do know quite a lot about the global economy. Let me introduce our panelists. On my left, I have Frederick Erickson. He is the founding director of the European Center for International Political Economy. He's a published author. One of his books is called The Innovation Illusion. Next to him is Bill Lee. Bill is the chief economist of the Millikan Institute. He spent a number of years at Citibank and as an economist there. He did his earlier work at the International Monetary Fund and at the Federal Reserve in the United States. He's got his PhD from Columbia. Next to him is Dr. Cao. Dr. Cao is the vice chairman and secretary general of the Shanghai Development Research Foundation. He's also an advisor to the Ministry of Finance in China and truly one of China's best economists. And next to him is Martin Ledrado. He is a visiting professor at Florida International University, if I have that correct, Martin. He has been the president of the Central Bank of Argentina. He's worked for the World Trade Organization, for the World Bank. He's also a venture capitalist, and he's a graduate of Harvard. So, with these four gentlemen, I think we can really do a good job of understanding the global economy. And I'll start right away with perhaps, the biggest issue for here, outside the window in the hotel, you can see China across the Yellow Sea. What is happening with the Chinese economy? If I understand it properly, depending upon whether you look at purchasing power parity or dollars, China is the first or the second economy of the world. Something about a housing bubble, something about data not coming from the Chinese government. Dr. Cao, what do you see happening in the Chinese economy in the next in this year and in the years after that, and what impact might have for the world and South Korea? Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you for your nice introduction. Actually, it's second time for me to attend the World Knowledge Forum. I feel very good to be back. Yesterday I've been attending many sessions. I feel China seems is a big elephant in the house. Everybody, take care of China. My simple summarize the performance of Chinese economy until now in 2024 is mixed because the government set the target for GDP growth for this year is around 5%. Actually, in first quarter, the GDP growth in China is 5.3%, but the second quarter, only 4.7%. So my feeling is 5% growth rate is achievable, but government should do more. I mean, carry more expansion, physical and monetary policy. As a monitor say, the big issue now is housing or real estate market in China. In past 2 or 3 years, investment or sales in real estate market has been down. The issue is, I guess, the situation in China has been different from that happened in U.S. many years ago. In U.S., if real estate market come down, it will have a tremendous impact on banking sector because the down payment in U.S. is very low, limited, sometimes even zero down payment. But in China, usually the down payment for mortgage loan very high, even 40%, even 50%, until several months ago, government reduced the down payment to 30%. So that way, not necessarily Chinese are very rich because they accumulate funding from several generations to pay down down payment.
But they must be very unhappy if if they've paid the down payments and the houses are worth less money.
Yeah, the issue is because the downside of real estate market have a tremendous impact on local government, because the revenue for local government most from sale of land. Now the sale of land tremendous reduce. Also plus the expense for pandemic several years ago. So that's the, I guess, big issue.
So Bill, if I understand Dr. Cowie saying 5% growth is possible, but the banking sector is okay, but consumer confidence is going to go through the floor.
Yes.
Local, how do you see the Chinese economy, Bill?
I think we in the West often characterize China as suffering from the three daunting Ds, right? You have dismal demographics, daunting debt, and deficient demand. And all of that, I think, is tied up to the property markets. You're absolutely right. But the one thing that I want to emphasize is that everyone says you need to do more fiscal policy. And if you do more fiscal policy, that means you got to spend more, issue more debt. Trouble is, the local governments are so indebted now. Their official debt is about 35% of GDP. Their unofficial debt, the local government financing vehicles, is about 45% of GDP. So there alone, you're almost 100% of GDP. And the Maastricht, right? When they created Maastricht and the euro area, they said keep debt to less than 60% of GDP. So China, even on the local level, not even counting the central government, is so indebted it cannot do the needed fiscal policy to push up demand to get you to 5% growth.
Now, Martin, in Latin America, China has enormous quantities of debt to Latin American countries, and China is very much engaged with Latin America. If China gets a cold, if China has problems, is that going to impact Latin America, or is it kind of safe?
Well, Latin America has two key variables that is very much dependent on. One is interest rates in the US, and the other is commodity prices. In terms of the opportunities that you have, fortunately, we are on the verge of a commodity boom that is not based on what happened at the beginning of the years 2000, which was the industrialization of China. That led to a lot of very strong demand for industrial commodities and agricultural commodities. Now there are three key trends in Latin America that are going in our direction. One is energy transition, the second one is energy security, and the third one is food security around the world. The demand in terms of green energy and the demand for energy transition is going to be so strong in the next decades. This is not a question of just one decade, but clearly when you look at, for example, the lithium triangle down in South America, which is composed by Chile, Bolivia, and Argentina, it has a relative advantage, for example, relative to Australia. In Australia, you extract lithium from rocks. In this golden triangle, you extract lithium from salt sort of flats where you evaporate the salt. So clearly there is a competitive advantage in lithium. In copper, we provide almost 60% of world copper, and as you know, lithium-ion batteries basically carry lithium and carry copper and manganese. So although China is very important in terms of what it's providing as a source of demand, it is not the only source of demand, and there are these three key megatrends that are going on in the world. Not only, I say, energy transition, the green economy, but also energy security. And you have, for example, LNG, natural gas, which is one of the critical elements in the transition. We won't have green energy or hydrogen energy. It's costly, and one of the key transitions could be done by LNG, by liquid natural gas, which is provided, for example, from Mexico down to Argentina. Argentina has the second largest basin in shale gas in the world, which is called in Spanish, vaca muerta. It's not a good name in English.
That means dead cow.
Dead
if
cow,
my Spanish,
dead cow.
yeah.
I would say it's a cow that is very much alive because it's producing liquid natural gas. And for example, one of the big investments from Asia in Latin America is Petronas. Petronas, the Malaysian company that is projecting a pipeline coming from Vaca Muerta down to the Atlantic and producing a liquefaction plant to export not only
To Asia.
To Asia, exactly.
So you say Latin America is not dependent upon China so much.
So it is China dependent, but not so much. There are these three forces that are now in the world, again, energy transition, energy security, and food security are providing other sources of demand rather than China. And interest rates, it's another important area because Latin America is dependent on flows, on capital flows from the rest of the world. So lower interest rates will mean more flows, not only to Latin America, I would say to all emerging markets.
Well, let me stay with you just for a minute, Martin, because you used to be a central banker. Now I'll get to you, Bill, in a minute. The American economy, while we are here at this debate stage, we have Donald Trump is talking to Kamala Harris in Pennsylvania. What do you think is going to happen to the American economy, depending upon who wins, and where is the Fed in this whole story?
Well, I think that the Fed is much more critical than the American economy. And let me give you a biased answer as a former central banker. The Fed, in my view, got it wrong at the beginning of the pandemic. I think one of the biggest mistakes in political economy in history was calling inflation a transitory phenomenon, in particular in the US. And this came out in the FOMC, that is in the reports of the Federal Open Market Committee. And as you've seen, again, it was an unprecedented shock to the world economy, but the massive inflow of monetary policy, the massive inflow of fiscal policy, all done together was a critical element that never happened before. Also, because we were all in our houses and we were all confined, this amount of money was basically channeled into goods and not into services. So we had that concept that all this flood of money, helicopter money that we had from fiscal push, the Treasury giving out checks to all people that were in their houses, to many companies, unfortunately, that were paper companies. So we had clearly a great fiscal expansion with a monetary expansion at a greater speed, at a fantastic speed that we've never seen before. So inflation was a natural cause that the Fed didn't catch at the beginning. I think they were too late to the game. What we've seen is a phenomenal, in a short period of time, in 12 months, we had a rise from 0 to 5.25%. It is unprecedented. We have to look to the decade of the 80s to see that kind of rise, and that has hurt the American economy in terms of the recovery. My point now is, will the Fed get it too late at this point, in terms that the key question in the US economy is the slowdown. And the slowdown that we have seen in the labor market, for example, if you look at the July meeting of the Federal Open Markets Committee, there you had already that the labor market was clearly with quite a slack. 2 days before, we had the increase in unemployment from 4.1 to 4.3%. The Fed met and it didn't move interest rates. In my view, and they should have done it at that point, and now they are running behind the curve in terms that the key risk for the U.S. economy is not only a slowdown, but also a recession.
Let me just get in here for a second. Thank you.
Bill, how do you see the American economy? What's going to happen in this election? How does it impact it?
When I first started as a professional economist, I spent my time at the Federal Reserve. And when I went to the IMF, they put me in charge of the US desk. And they said, Bill, you're going to have the hardest job at the IMF. And why is that? Because all these economists that we have here, these international economists from Argentina, from Asia, they're all trained in the US. And they know so much about the US economy. The newspapers report exclusively about the US economy. So everybody's a US expert. Right? Everybody's an expert on the U.S. economy. So let me just set the framework for what's normal in the U.S. economy. Number one, right, the unemployment rate between 4 and 4.5% is considered normal. That's about most people's estimate of the natural rate. That's where the economy would be if we're growing at the natural rate of growth, which is about 1.5% to 2%. And the Fed is now targeting inflation to come down to about 2%. And when people say, oh my God, we're in a recession because we went 0.5 percentage point up on the unemployment rate, 3.5% to 4.5%, a huge jump increase. There was no layoffs. Nobody was laying off people. The reason why the unemployment rate went up was because so many people said, wow, opportunities are good now, I should go and look for a job. And more people started looking for a job. So to say that the US economy is teetering on a recession or even in a recession is ridiculous. That's number one.
Well, I think Mr. Trump will probably be saying that right now. But let's not get too deeply into this, because otherwise we're not going to get it through the rest of the world.
But to characterize the U.S. economy, I think to fairly characterize it, at least in this expert's opinion, it's doing very well, extraordinarily well. It's been growing at way above potential for several years now because it's rebounded, rightly because Martin said, so much stimulus was put into the economy. Fiscal policy going forward only has two characteristics. One is from the Inflation Reduction Act, which is badly named because it didn't reduce inflation. All it did was reshape medical care. And the CHIPS Act, which is an industrial policy on the part of the United States to try to bring back a lot of manufacturing, especially of high-end semiconductors, into the United States. That's where fiscal policy is right now. It's not doing anything other than reshaping the U.S. economy. It is actually overstimulating, as Martin said, the U.S. economy. Monetary policy is set at a short-term objective of bringing inflation back to 2%, and it seems to have done that. But I think for Korea, the most important part about the U.S. economy right now is what's happening to trade policy. Because as you know, right, Mr. Trump I love tariffs. That's the one campaign that he did from 2016 onward. And Biden and Harris have said, we don't like tariffs, but they're okay. All of you have taken Econ 101. Econ 101, you say, tariffs are terrible. Tariffs distort. Tariffs make you worse off. Tariffs raise inflation. Tariffs lower growth. How much did the tariffs change U.S. growth? 0.3% over 2 years. 0.3%. How much did it raise prices? Consumer prices? Hardly at all. Hardly at all. Because a lot of it was absorbed in profit margins. Now, I think one of the things that you have to learn beyond Econ 101 is that we don't live in a world of free trade, we live in a distorted world. So what the tariff policy is trying to do across countries is to try to reshape your own economy. You're trying to subsidize certain industries, and you're trying to prevent people from over-consuming other sectors. So it's really shifting consumption and shifting production. The first thing you learn about tariff when you take international economics, which I used to teach at Columbia, was tariff is a consumption tax and a production subsidy, right? Those are two things. And it generates revenue.
Bill, we don't have time for your lecture.
But I'm just saying, the message here is, right, tariffs are not necessarily a bad thing. They can be used wisely if they are used wisely.
Well, if Trump wins the election, more tariffs are coming. Frederick, from a European perspective, how do you see the American economy? What's going to happen?
Well, I mean, first of all, I mean, if we look at the broad orientation on trade policy, I think, I mean, the main answer to the question, why didn't Trump's increase in tariffs, why didn't it fuel consumer prices more? Why didn't it fuel inflation more? Well, partly because it was mostly bilateral. And that's what we know from trade policy, which is that if you go against one country, it may be a big country like China, and you raise tariffs on export from that country, what you're going to do is a reshuffling of trade. Exactly. The export you used to get from China is now going to come from other countries, and this is what we've seen in American trade data. However, what the main tariff man, as he now labels himself, Mr. Trump, he wants to raise taxes on all US trade. It's not just about China anymore. He wants to have a 10% tariff on trade with Europe, 10% tariff on trade with Latin America, and I can assure you that is going to have an inflationary impulse in the economy. That's going to have consequences for both raising consumer prices in America and, of course, reducing export competitiveness of US firms, because a lot of this import is going to American manufacturers that then re-exports what they import to the rest of the world. So I would be more careful about sort of that trend in American policy. And mind you, what Trump is saying is that he wants to go back to the 19th century tax code in America, which is to erase all federal income tax and substitute that with tariffs. And that, of course, means that you need to have a giant increase in tariffs in order to affect it. I don't think it's possible to achieve that, but
Frederick, while you have the microphone, maybe you could talk a little bit about the European economy. We've talked about the Chinese economy. We've talked about the American economy. 5% for China, 2.5% for the U.S. What do you see happening in Europe?
well, now we're really going into dark territories. No, I mean, cyclically, Europe has been, for all purposes, in what we can call a recession. And that, of course, been true for a large economy like the German economy, which represents more than 1/3 of the entire Eurozone economy. It's been weighed down by first the pandemic, by the war in Ukraine, which had a huge impact on energy prices, and of course,
it's still
then
going
by
on 2.5 years in. I mean,
yeah, it does. But I mean, the energy price impact that came on the heels of Russia's invasion into Ukraine, I mean, that's been weakening a lot.
That's been absorbed.
It's been absorbed, and energy prices has gone down. But I mean, the major problem for Europe is not the cyclical short term. It's the fact that its long-term outlook isn't very good. We had just 2 days ago the formal president of the European Central Bank, Mario Draghi, coming out with a very stern, depressing analysis of the European economy, where he's basically going to say that unless you do my program, which is pretty radical by European standards, you're first going to feel agony and then pain. And, you know, that's the former central bank president talking here, which is that Europe is on a long-term path of very weak underlying growth, weak GDP per capita growth, weak productivity growth, weak performance in the R&D sector, weak performance in corporate
Frederick,
investment.
at the same time, Europeans are happy. They have a high standard of living, amazing healthcare, long vacations. I mean, what's wrong with that?
Well, I mean, long vacations, that may be true, but I don't think Europeans are happy. I think we are seeing a lot of resentment, a lot of frustration at the ballot boxes, and we've been doing that for quite some time. I think the rise of populism plus many other things, which of course happens both on the right and the left, is certainly a result of the fact that we live in a European economy with low economic opportunities, where we almost are permanently demoted to have low economic expectations. Difficult to get a place to live, a house if you're a young person. Unemployment among young people are pretty high. We see demographic developments are not going to be helping us much, because we're going to push up cost for pensions and push for cost for healthcare, while we don't have sort of enough labor in order to substitute for those going into retirement. So I'm pretty pessimistic about the European economy.
Now, as you gentlemen talk about China, the United States, and Europe, it almost seems, and especially if you read the press and listen to the speeches, that we're moving to some kind of a new world order with trade blocs which don't talk to each other, almost Orwellian in its. But I understand if you look at the trade data, there's still enormous quantities of world trade going all around the world.
Absolutely.
So
absolutely.
Are we at the end of globalization as we know it, or is that just a political smokescreen, and really the data doesn't support that?
Well,
and I'll go to all of you. I think all of you might have an opinion on this one.
But if I just, I think it's a political smokescreen. What is true is that when you look at trade in manufacturers, trade in goods, it's been basically going sideways since 2014, 2015. But that's not surprising, given that we are in a structural shift in the entire global economy, where we go towards services and we go toward much more tech-oriented type of cross-border flows and cross-border exchanges. And when we start to look at this world of new globalization, how knowledge, ideas, patents, technologies, digital services are crossing borders, I think we are on the verge of a new boom of globalization. Okay. It's just that a lot of people talking about it and sort of predicting the end of globalization, they are staring at old globalization. They're staring at sort of old trade in data.
Okay, let me go from you to Martin, and then to Dr. Cao, and then back to Bill. Martin, go ahead.
Well, there is a new globalization, and this new globalization is given by the concept of friendshoring, nearshoring, or allied shoring. That is to say, what happened with Russia invasion to Ukraine, with the pandemic, is that companies want suppliers to be reliable. So what you have at this point is companies that are looking for suppliers that are closer, that are reliable, that will have long-term contracts. So for example, in the case of China and its relationship with the US, what you have seen is a diminishing of around 5% of Chinese export to the US, but wisely enough, the trade between China and Mexico, Mexico is used as a key supplier of the US, has increased by almost that amount or most. So what you see now is Chinese investments going into Mexico in order to supply the United States. So there is a different type of globalization, and that is given by the type of suppliers that you get. Interestingly enough, you mentioned, Mike, the IRA, the Inflation Recovery Act, which had nothing to do with inflation, but was mainly
it's the new Green Deal, right? Disguised as something else.
It was a Green Deal, basically. I mean, basically giving subsidies to companies that produce 80% of their products, of their goods that go into the green economy. But interestingly enough, with countries that have already free trade agreements with the United States. That is to say, if you produce a lithium battery that is done in Chile or in Peru or in Mexico that has already a free trade agreement, you got the subsidy of $7,500 of a car when you buy it in the United States. So I would say that there is a different globalization, that there is a different view of suppliers, and also what is over is the big trading agreements. Okay, the big sort of free trade agreements that we've seen of the European Union, free trade agreements with different blocs. We have had trouble in getting past a trade agreement between the European Union and Mercosur, which is Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, and Paraguay. So big trade deals are over. It's more localized, focused on the kind of supplier. One last word about what Professor Lee said. My point, and if you look at what the Fed policy is the Fed policy is a risk management approach. So they do a base scenario and then they do the balance of risk in order to maintain in that scenario. My point is that inflation is no longer a risk, but a slowdown is a risk, and that you cannot maintain such high interest rates when inflation is going down to personal consumption expenditure to 2.6%. You cannot have a real interest rate of 2.5%, 5.5% over. So my point is that now the risk, the balance of risk is more on a slowdown. You don't only see it in the labor market, but also in the earnings of companies. But coming down to trade blocks is a new globalization what we are facing.
Thank you, Martin.
Okay.
Dr. Cal, how do you see from China? Because there's an argument that says China, you know, the Americans see China as a threat. Chinese say we're just trying to do our own business. You know, how do you see China, and are we at the end of globalization?
Okay, I fully agree what Martin just pointed out to the shift of foreign trade from China. I guess in near future, whatever who take White House, the American policy to China wouldn't big change. That means they still will, they call small yard, high fence, by high tariff, section, or export control, whatever. But at the same time, yes, I want to point these strategy in some way play out. You look at the figure, the U.S. export, among the total U.S. export, the share from China have already come down.
A little bit or a lot?
Come down. Yeah, that's maybe reduced probably 5% or something like that. But at the same time, the amount of export from China to U.S. still continue to grow. That something happened at the same time.
Yeah.
Also, as a Martin point, so in order to avoid the section or high tariff from U.S., some export to other countries like Mexico, Vietnam, or other countries, then re-export to China. Also now many Chinese companies to go overseas to make investment there. That's something just happening in China. So what I try to say is, I look at the data. Actually, yesterday, Chinese government issued the trade data, August. It's very interesting. The export from China grows 8.7%. So that's the bright point for Chinese economy. As the William Lee point out, now in China, domestic demand very efficient. But at the same time, unexpected, then most people actually export from China very strong. That supports China continued growth. Maybe in this year, as I say, probably can reach 5% or maybe a little bit low than 5%.
JC,
so
thank you.
That's the basic.
Bill, on this issue of globalization, so are we seeing the end of globalization? Is it a new globalization, as Frederick says, or is it just a rearranging of globalization?
It's a recognition that globalization, as it was taking place after China joined WTO in early 2000, it was a huge distortion on the world economy because of China's success. China was so successful in producing stuff, goods, manufacturing goods and light industrial stuff, so successful, it was so cheap, everybody wanted to buy from China. So China's success caused a huge distortion, and now the world says, besides efficiency and cheap stuff, I want safety in my supply chains. I want soundness and stability in my supply chains.
Resilience.
And resilience so that I can depend on it, and national security. So these are elements that now have come in to reshape global trade. And the friendshoring that Martin talked about, he's absolutely right. By the way, you hear a consensus that's very unusual here, right? We all agree globalization is changing and needs to be ended. And I'm telling you why. Because of the additional things that have to be put in place. Safety, soundness, security, stability. And for Korea, I think the most important thing is really hinted at by what Martin said. Going into the new trade agreements should be much more regional, your main trading partners, and bilateral trade deals, because they're easier to target. Korea knows what it wants to do with its own industry. You want to help certain industries. You want to push more resources into certain industries because it gives you a better economy, stronger economy. You do that with trade deals, bilateral trade deals, by putting those terms with your main trading partners. If you try to get 5 or 10 countries together to agree on those same terms, that's almost impossible to get that agreement. Somebody's going to hold out, and it'll take forever to do that kind of stuff. So I think for Korea going forward, especially because Korea trades with both China and the U.S.,
those are number 1 and 2, I think, for Korea.
Exactly, those are the main trading partners. So it's this really, really smart. It's something I said last year when I was at this forum, to have these bilateral arrangements negotiated fairly quickly, and can be changed fairly quickly depending upon how your economy changes. And what's smart about the arrangements for Korea is that your semiconductor agreements with the U.S. is to supply the U.S. with inputs for the high-end semiconductors, but also with China, you managed to negotiate with the U.S. ways of getting around the sanctions. So I think that for Korea, this new regionalization, this new friendshoring is Korea shoring as far as the U.S. is concerned. And I think that's something that is going to be very helpful for Korea going forward.